In my previous video in regards to the thematic structure of Hunter x Hunter, we looked at how strong environmental influences have on our world, creating a domino effect of vastly selfish actions, in which spawns deeper cynicism as the consequences of actions come full throttle. The theme here heavily plays on the notion that at some point, in order for us to find true salvation, we shouldn't surrender ourselves to the calamities of human nature. Instead of succumbing or ignoring it, we have the option to see that there is a way out of the darkness we may find ourselves in. And whether we are blind due to our anguish or rage, there is always a bigger picture to be seen here. As I mentioned before, vengeance is simplistic and easily empathizing, as it is only common that when injustice is committed, the search for justice will persevere. But more often than not, the culmination of our extreme and at times radical emotions delude us on the path towards self-destruction. The previous arcs of Hunter x Hunter are an amalgamation of themes, all of which diverge at one singular point. Morality is complex. A world of moral ambiguity is quite common in several works of fiction, and Hunter x Hunter is no different. The Hunter exam represents that hunters are not perceived as morally just, and at times shows us glimpses of how cruel the world can get, whether societal or environmental. And the Zoldyck and Heaven's Arena arc represents how a group of people can thrive in such a world financially. And York New inconspicuously represents the collective ramifications of that world gone unchecked. But what separates Hunter x Hunter from the herd is that more often than not, especially in works of shonen, moral ambiguity is usually represented by the antagonist or a flawed ethical perception by the society affected by that world. Add in a main character whose ideals stand as a beacon of hope, unwavering and never to falter, and you have a clear-cut and, dare say, unrealistic approach to the solutions against correcting a world that is so wrong. It is easy to come to the conclusion that correcting the issues of a world so wrong can be done when good triumphs, but the unrealistic approach here is a character whose ideals never falter, never to be influenced by their environment, if even just for a second, as when their ideals fail, then our hero too will fail. The driving constant here is that the main characters of these stories are meant to represent an optimistic and ideal philosophy, placed in a world where the prevailing pessimism will clash, only to be defeated and overwritten, shown the error of their ways, changing everyone's lives for the better, and becoming the bright and shining hero of the story. In Hunter x Hunter, Togashi challenges this notion as he places flawed and broken characters as both our villainous and main cast. Gon is Togashi's commentary on the constant unrealistic approach to solving world issues, as his naive headstrong optimism is a representation of most shonen MCs sticking to their guns and Christopher Columbusing their idealistic philosophies onto everyone's asses. And this is not to say that this is the wrong way to go about things, because at several points in the story, we see those same idealistic behaviors work in Gon's favor. But the criticism here is that this mindset is perceived as childish. It is immature and unnatural that an antagonist with ambitions or circumstantial reasons to be the way they are can have their ideals become malleable simply by gaining friends or getting talk no jutsu'd as they conform to the bright and idealistic beacon that is the main character's ideals. Environmental influences is a prevalent factor in creating characters with believable ambitions and rational actions, which plays a huge part in what makes the Phantom Troop so endearing. Kurapika's rage towards the Phantom Troop isn't entirely predicated on the fact that his clan members were slaughtered, but more so the reason. For what reasons do these atrocities occur? For what reason does a person find the need to commit such evil? It perplexes him so that even if he were to have received the honest truth from Uvogin, his rage would have never faltered, resigning himself on the path of blood as his rage continues to destroy him. While most is theorized, it makes sense how the Phantom Troop came to be, and it's due to those circumstances that may not justify their bloodshed, but rationalizes it. The York New arc does not paint either side as being right, but both being wrong in some way, and while both parties come to be involved with Gon, their perceptions of their worlds are not changed by his optimism, at least not completely. The Phantom Troop still sheds blood, and Kurapika continues his quest for vengeance, both spiraling down a dark path unbecoming of characters who have become so involved with the hero of the story, at least in Kurapika's case. And Togashi implies that the only way out is to allow yourself to be embraced in love and care. It is only then where we can look outside of ourselves and contemplate the circumstance and reason. And for the Phantom Troop, regardless of cultural relativism, only by understanding the value of their own lives, as the members do for Chrollo, will they finally understand the value of human lives as a whole, and the gravity of their transgressions as they come to repent. All of the world's evil is within human reason. But remove the human reason, and all that evil that is left could only be described as monstrous or demonic, void of any logic, sanity, or emotional compassion. And factor in a bright and endearing youth into such a world, and things start to become even more complex than before, as Togashi asks of us yet again to examine and challenge the inherent transparency of our worlds, as the commonalities of the inner machinations of human society is completely flipped on its head, with the tables taking a turn for the worst. The Greed Island arc serves to misconstrue the audience of what is to come, contrast to the moral grayness of the previous arcs due to the fact that they're in a video game. It is fitting that morality in this world would suddenly shift black and white, introducing a cutthroat villain-hero dynamic as Gon and Killua, with the help of Biscuit, gain strength in order to overcome their adversary. While at first the Greed Island arc may seem as not having much to offer in Hunter x Hunter's narratives, but missing the point is entirely the point. It sets a safety net of expectations, as Togashi's deconstructions of modern shonen tropes comes full circle, as the safety net is unexpectedly ripped from beneath us, forcefully pulling the sheet covers, waking us from our dream, and to face the morally grey world once more. What is evil? Is it the absence of good? Is it only when wickedness is committed? Or is it only when it conflicts with our own sense of morals? The nature of evil has been debated for years, and in reality, one's perspective of evil is entirely predicated on their moral disposition. But for the sake of this video, we will look at the term objectively, as this is a big theme in Hunter x Hunter. Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil by Hannah Arendt, is a book published in 1963 of the trial against Adolf Eichmann. Adolf Eichmann was a German-Austrian and one of the major organizers of the Holocaust, the final solution to the Jewish question in Nazi terminology. Adolf Eichmann and his staff were in charge of the massive transportation of the Jewish people to the extermination camp, where 437,000 of 725,000 were murdered. Almost 20 years later, after being on the run from American forces, Adolf Eichmann was captured and sentenced to death. The trial was widely followed in the media and was later the subject of several books, including Hannah Arendt's Banality of Evil. In The Banality of Evil, Arendt, a Jewish woman who fled Germany during Adolf Hitler's rise to power, reported on Eichmann's trial. Expecting to be faced with extreme prejudice due to her Jewish background, what was in front of her was nothing short of unexpected. The man displayed no guilt, nor any resentment towards those who were trying him, claiming he bore no responsibility because he was simply doing his job. Eichmann stated himself that he had always tried to abide by Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative, but Arendt retorted that Eichmann forgot the golden rule to this philosophy, that golden rule being the principle of treating others the way you want to be treated. When Eichmann was charged with carrying out the final solution, Arendt claimed he had ceased to live according to Kantian principles that he had known it, and that he had consoled himself with the thoughts that he no longer was the master of his own deeds, that he was unable to change anything. Upon the book's release, Arendt received considerable amounts of backlash for portraying what most consider an inhumane monster as a normal, empathizable person. But I think they're missing the bigger picture here. The traditional perception of evil is when acts of wickedness are committed due to a lack of morals or for personally motivated reasons. Arendt had received several backlashes and criticism for what seemed to be her portrayal of normalcy in a man whom was considered so evil. But that isn't the point. The point being that even though her portrayal of Eichmann did not fall under the traditional perceptions of evil, what he did was still evil, but for different reasons. Eichmann lacked the self-awareness to think for himself, to live for himself, and as a result, he lived a life where his actions were justified by placing his responsibilities as a person, but more importantly as a human being, onto someone or something bigger than he. And because of it, he felt no remorse for the countless lives he was indirectly responsible for taking. Eichmann lacked self-awareness, but because he lacked it, it begs the question: is this truly evil? In Hunter x Hunter, from the Hunter exam to the York New arc, Togashi not only challenges the viewers in what their perceptions of evil are, but challenges whether we can empathize and understand the reasons for that evil to have been born, and to look at the bigger picture.
なぜ自分たちと関わりのない人間を殺せるの?
Traditionally speaking, a villain is commonly written as a tool used to accentuate the heroic qualities of the main character. An impediment to the hero, whether they share similar traits or not, are meant to be defeated and to emphasize the ideals of our hero. Villains are often begrudgingly motivated, selfishly pursuing a goal at the cost of others without remorse or regret, all under the villain's awareness that what they are doing is what their world would consider bad or evil. But when a villain shows no remorse for their actions due to not understanding or not having the same moral disposition as us or the hero, is it possible to begin viewing their acts under an objective lens? If we could look outside of our own moral compass, can we find ways to rationalize the evil in this world?
なぜだろうな。関係ないからじゃないか。いや、改めて問われると答えがたいものだな。動機の言語化か。あまり好きじゃないしな。しかし案外、いや、やはりと言うべきか。自分をつかむ鍵はそこにあるか。
Keeping what I had said previously in mind, we move forward to the Chimera Ant arc, where Togashi challenges us even further on our perceptions of evil. While adorable and incredibly endearing, Kurt and Reina serve an important narrative tool to the Chimera Ant arc. Witnessing a bright and courageous youth protect their doting sister is easily empathizing, and their pure perceptions of fondness for each other is a clear representation of a child's innocence. Now, fast forward to literally 10 seconds, and we witness that pure innocence being swiftly and brutally taken away. Togashi yet again achieves moral clarity to his viewers, as it is not hard to empathize with the cruel act of taking the lives of children. But is this truly evil? The justification here, however, is that even though the act can be seen as evil, the act itself holds no malice, as these are simply animals acting off of natural instinct. Natural instinct is a largely inheritable and unalterable tendency of an organism to make a complex and specific response to environmental stimuli without involving reason. The lack of reason demonstrates a void of morality, as morality involves making a choice behind one's reasoning. In comparison to the Phantom Troop, their acts of evil were derived from a lack of understanding of their own morality due to the influence of their environments, which can possibly be empathized with some people. But a crime against humanity without reason can only be seen as evil. Or rather, whether it can be seen as evil or not is irrelevant. The existence of the Chimera Ants are a threat to not only humanity's systematic hierarchy, but their overall existence as a whole. And as such, humanity will operate under their natural instinct of self-preservation by eliminating the threat of their existence. The moral clarity here, albeit species are humans, is that if a threat to the general existence of humanity appears, it by all means must be stopped. Adding on to the fact that these creatures operate without reason or morality, it is clear evermore that humanity and Chimera Ants can never coexist, as we witness a development of malice and joy that these creatures have in their what was originally an instinctual hunt to feed, has now turned into a brutally one-sided egotistical manhunt, selling the point that these creatures lack the morality, let alone empathy, to be considered preserving.
だったら俺たちも手段を選ばず女王様を守ればいいだけの話だ。そうさ。必ず守る。レイナは俺が守る。レイナ?
Togashi is a menace, and I love him for it. If being able to understand and sympathize with the Phantom Troop wasn't enough, after showcasing what was presented to be a brutal force whose sole purpose was to be stopped, Togashi flips the script and makes the impossible possible, and this surely wouldn't be the last. Episode 80, Evil and Terrible, was one of the many turning points of the arc. Not only was this the episode which serves to introduce Gyro and the narrative stances on the bleaker parts of humanity, but the sudden discovery of Chimera Ants retaining their humanity of previous lives suddenly shifted a clear black and white antagonistic dynamic into one of moral grayness. Colt has clearly adopted the traits to protect from Kurt, and his memories of Reyna appear subconscious, but this one simple line, this brief moment of recollection, changes everything. With this piece of information, one can immediately recognize that these Chimera Ants who up to this point were seen as monstrous and unfeeling are now suddenly removed from an objective lens and onto a subjective one. The realization that these creatures are regaining their humanity from their previous lives places the viewers in an ethical dilemma. While originally we arguably felt that these monstrosities had to be stopped simply because they were anything but human, but with the sudden possibility of these creatures retaining their humanity, it brings forth the variable that separates humans from animals. That variable being the ability to reason. Contemporarily, however, Togashi implies that it may be too late, as Gon and the gang unknowingly engage in combat against what some would consider their fellow man, as one of them harkens back to their humanity just before they are killed once more. The fact that it was Kurt who was the first to illustrate the return of their past lives' memories depicts the cruel possibility that this child may have to suffer death once again if these actions continue further. At the end of the episode, the possibility of the Chimera Ant's redemption grows weaker, as we come to witness arguably the most brutal death in the series, demonstrating that despite this new information, it may be all too late.
Yo. Oh! なんという強さ。それが世の力。暴力こそこの世で最も強い力。
Ask anyone the question about why they should watch Hunter x Hunter, or more specifically the Chimera Ant arc, and more often than not, the answer one will get is surrounded around or directly related to the king of the Chimera Ants, Meruem. From the very beginning of the arc, the Chimera Ant King has always been a foreboding tool, used to foreshadow an astounding formidable force, greatly accentuated with the introduction of Pito, of the immeasurable power and impossible odds that our heroes will eventually have to overcome. During the very moments of the King's birth and afterwards, the King's actions represent just that. A completely ruthless and evil existence, not just for humanity, but for the Chimera Ants as well, as Meruem, without as much as a thought, kills and feeds on his own. In traditional writing, this is usually the motif of the proverb, "The enemy of my enemy is my friend," suggesting that two parties work together against a common foe, and the story does indeed follow through with this notion. But as we've seen before, Togashi does not follow traditional story writing, as he subverts our expectations completely with the brilliant and astounding characterization that is Meruem. Akin to the events during the beginning of the Chimera Ant arc, the beginning of Meruem's characterization follows the exact same patterns from the start of the arc, as Meruem invades a nearby village and kills the parents of a young and helpless child, and soon after, the child as well. Much like Kurt and Reina, the narrative once again attempts to empathize the idea to the viewer that Meruem is truly evil, by using a child to test his killing methods, and naturally, the act itself can only be seen as completely vile. But again, Togashi utilizes this to serve the groundwork to test his viewers once more of the themes and philosophies that Hunter x Hunter is attempting to demonstrate. Shortly after, Meruem infiltrates the Republic of East Gorto, where he comes face to face with a man proclaiming himself to be the King of Kings, yet he sees nothing. At this point, the criteria for one to be named king is power in his eyes, in which he can only wonder how such a person can proclaim himself such a status. Shayapuf reveals to him that it is common for the title of king to be bestowed and passed on to lineage or connections among human hierarchy. And ironically, this baffles Meruem. Despite the fact that the title of king was also given to him from blood and lineage as well, but because Meruem has immense power, he deems himself fit to be the one true king. Meruem's quote of power to rule here, "Power in the hands of an incompetent will only bring ruin," is in reference to the source of all the world's moral ambiguity. When a leader of a country is responsible for the strife and pessimism, their people's ideals will follow, giving birth to a chain of corruption that influenced the world greatly, causing individuals to be selfish to their own desires, self-centered and self-absorbed, unable to see outside of their perception that the world revolves around them. However, while Meruem criticizes Diego's disposition to his status, right as he may be, it is at its core a contradiction. Diego was a ruthless dictator who had established an oppressive government to his people. Having a totalitarian regime, the citizens of East Gorto are controlled by fear and oppression. So what separates Diego from Meruem? Although Meruem sees no physical strength in Diego, they both figuratively have the same amount of power. Both rule with fear and totalitarian principles. Were the Chimera Ants void of humanity and personal ethics with the likes of the Royal Guards, this argument would be null and void. But as we saw before, and we'll see after, that isn't the case, and would only reinforce Meruem's perception that incompetent rule will inevitably bring devastation. As the story progresses, it shows that that devastation may soon become reality, as few of his own kind plots to rebel against him by colluding with mankind to bring down their king once and for all. Humanity is capable of the revolting and depraved. We selfishly destroy every living being, including ourselves and the world we live in. We are vain and overconfident, morally hypocritical, and we tend to dehumanize ourselves to justify the means to an end, even if the actions taken may conflict with our own sets of principles. In the short time that Meruem has been alive up to this point, his initial impressions of humans are that they are weak and tepid, ever complacent to the arrogance of the position they hold towards other living things, as when a force came in opposition to that status they hold, that status was easily destroyed. And all of this comes full circle to Meruem upon meeting Diego, confounded by the idea of how someone with such power can bring forth such corruption. However, when he was met with the desperate cries of the former king's subjects, he shared no condolences or any shred of empathy towards the position that very corruption put them in, but instead condemns them for humanity's arrogance of not being able to think outside of themselves, asking them if they even thought of sparing a moment to think of the same desperate cries of the animals they slaughter for food every day. While Meruem surpasses humanity in physical strength, what separated humanity from the species Meruem is a part of is the intellect humanity holds. While Meruem is the product of an individual with extreme power, able to take down all the world's obstacles with a simple wave of his tail, it's through this mindset that he begins to look inwards and concludes that instead of growing stagnatingly complacent as humans have, the only thing left for Meruem to transcend, to tower above humanity as the ultimate species, is knowledge. And as a result, Meruem begins to study board games in order to hone his tactical prowess. He defeats world champions in strategic games like chess, shogi, and go, ultimately killing his opponents after defeating them, coming to the conclusion that once he defeats them all, there will be no one left in the world who can oppose him in both physical and mental strength. The next and final opponent Meruem had to defeat was a young girl named Komugi, a completely childish and clumsy girl whom had a tendency to overspeak her thoughts, to the point where even I as a viewer begged and beseeched her to stop before Meruem turned her into a stain on the rug. But yet he doesn't. Meruem isn't so petty as to kill someone over a mild disturbance when all he cares about at the moment is victory and gaining dominance over his opponent. Komugi's place in the story is a weird one, setting her clumsy and ditzy personality in front of a brutal tyrant in arguably the darkest arc of the anime created extreme tension but yet a lighthearted and playful atmosphere, where for the first time Meruem was free of the judgment and apprehension of his domineering presence. But that matters not to Meruem. Komugi was nothing more than a pebble on the road to his ambitions. Once he defeats her, she will become the same as the rest. But as soon as the game begins, Komugi completely shifts her demeanor, all while playing Gungi, that same childish girl Meruem would lose to again and again and again. Meruem, a king whom one would perceive as extremely prideful, the same king who despises repeating himself and is quick to dispose of any for their disobedience regardless of how arbitrary, finds himself constantly losing to whom he considered a lowly human being. Again they play, and again he loses, but instead of feeling shame, he finds the games they play joyful, and yet he does not know why he feels this way. It frustrates him so that the only way he knows how to rationalize it is to defeat her and Gungi once and for all. Meruem, with his limited understanding of only the dark side of humanity, attempts to influence Komugi in that regards, by appealing to her greed and stipulating her fear to create hesitation in order to become triumphant once and for all. But, much to his surprise, Komugi held no desire, nor held no fear, but yet shows the incredible resolve to forfeit her own life were she to lose what some would consider a trivial game of Gungi. And for the first time, a human being was able to bring about an expression from Meruem outside of a menacing or disgusted expression. Komugi, a mere human, broke Meruem from his constant calm and rational demeanor. But why does this surprise Meruem? Perhaps the reason is that in that moment, he saw an individual obligated to duty, ready to forfeit her entire being for failure, much like the tendencies of the Chimera Ants and Royal Guards. And it was at this point that Komugi's words were the catalyst that caused Meruem to see humans under a different perspective. This is the point in Meruem's characterization that would change him forever, as he comes to the conclusion that instead of a human who he saw as petty, a human that is able to sink to the depths to gain what they desire, it was Meruem who committed such a lowly act, and Komugi that emerged triumphant. Meruem unconsciously begins to see Komugi in a respectable light. After losing to Komugi again and again, he humbles himself, tearing his own arm off to atone for his crude suggestions, and even starts asking her questions on how he could play proficiently in Gungi, instead of thinking that he could do it without the help of a human. Meruem, of his own volition and curiosity, asked for her name, in which Komugi asked for his name in response. But Meruem had no idea what his name was. This is the moment where Meruem begins to become conflicted with his ant tendencies, gaining self-awareness as he begins to become cognizant of his humanity, and it all stems from Komugi. Komugi is the impetus towards tackling the biased and narrow-minded perception that Meruem has against humanity. Meruem saw only the worst in humanity. Humans are selfish. Humans are arrogant, a blight to the world that does not deserve the status they hold. Meruem, with his supreme power, can change that status. Such is his goal. Meruem sees humans as nothing more than an existence that is beneath his own, but ironically, it was through that mindset that came with its own sets of contradictions. Here, Meruem is selfish. Here, Meruem is arrogant, and it's due to the sheer amount of dominating power he has and his disgust towards humanity's pathetic dispositions that leads him to hold his head high and look down on the very existence that he was programmed to destroy and conquer. But unbeknownst to him, meeting Komugi was the start in which completely shifts Meruem's dispositions. Up till now, every human that Meruem has encountered has naturally been met with either confrontation and disrespect, or fear and anxiety. However, with Komugi, while she does acknowledge Meruem's position as supreme leader, she does not show any fear or apprehension towards Meruem. Instead, she treats him just as she would any opponent, as an equal. For the first time in his life, Meruem, albeit figuratively, is able to have his intellect and power matched while playing this simple game with Komugi. On this board, there is no status, no physical strength to compare to, no variable outside of their own mental aptitude towards playing this game. And it's through this simple game that Meruem is able to take a step back and see his opponent outside of his arrogance. A mere lowly human is beating me. This female human is beating me. Komugi is defeating me. It's at this point where Meruem achieves Perspectivism. While Perspectivism does not regard all perspectives and interpretations as being of equal truth or value, it holds that no one has access to an absolute view of the world cut off from their own perspective. Instead, all such viewing occurs from some point of view in which in turn affects how things are perceived. Having the will to obligate your life to duty, so readily being able to discard it with the perception of what exactly is your place in the world, omitting your arrogance, free of dread and trepidation. Having a playful and silly demeanor that challenges the overwhelming presence of Meruem's authority is probably the chemistry in which allows them both to have a discussion without restraint. But more important than that is the aptitude and ability to be the very best at what you obligate yourself to. But despite being the very best, Komugi's growth is far from over, as Meruem is able to see firsthand of the power that Komugi has obtained and will further strengthen as she hones her prowess. And it's through this where Meruem's Perspectivism grows even deeper, as he questions his identity and purpose.
世は王だ。だが、世は何者だ。世は一体何のために生まれてきた。
Meruem reaches out to his royal guards, calling each of their name and understand their purpose to serve him, all the while questioning his own. Additionally expressing how Komugi has gained power and will become much stronger, although only at Gungi. Even going so far as to reflect on the fact that he killed a child and robbed them of the potential for that child to surpass him in something. However, that potential, identity, purpose, it was all meaningless to him. Meruem is the king of kings, and as such, the immeasurable power he holds is able to rob all living things of such potential, and concludes that the power he wields is the ultimate power, and crushing the weak is his purpose. With his ant tendencies coming full circle, he decides to finally end Komugi's life. After all, Komugi is weak and powerless to his brutal might. With the selection drawing near, he steels his resolve towards ending this farce and defeating his opponent once and for all. But as soon as he opens those doors, he sees Komugi being attacked, unable to defend or protect herself against something so insignificant. Komugi is weak. Komugi is powerless. Without so much as a thought, he quickly comes to her aid, enraged at the sight of this frail girl covered in blood and confused as to why she didn't call for anyone's help. Looking back to how Komugi views herself as a burden or trash, she responds that she did not wish to be a bother to anyone. Without hesitation, Meruem responds that she is not a bother and that she is an important guest, all the while being confused shortly after as to why he is saying such things to her. How can Meruem, the king of kings, spare such charity? But before Meruem could get his thoughts together, Komugi is moved to tears, telling Meruem that this is the first time that someone has been this nice to her. Meruem, a king who exudes extreme dominance, a being feared by all, who kills anyone without any real reason at all, whether it be humans or his own kind, is the nicest person that Komugi has ever met. And finally, the foundation has been set for the powerful themes and messages that is Hunter x Hunter.
ありと何一つ変わらない。いや、それ以上に。
A common discussion I find myself having, and one that is often talked about among many people, is whether or not humanity is inherently evil. A discussion which brings about many dark topics and truths that most people would shy away from and choose to ignore.
Because we like to think we're peaceful, but we're not. In fact, I would say that the normative human being is just as much terrified and murderous as calm and collected. Everything has to be right for you to be calm and collected.
Upon my first watch of Hunter x Hunter, I never quite understood, nor came to the realization of the impact and ramifications of Gyro's character, as I simply saw it as a character exposition on the side of an arc already established and progressing, meant to allude towards setting up a conflict later on in the story, which is 100% true. But after rewatching Hunter x Hunter a second and even a third time, I've come to realize that Togashi has created a story and world so incredibly nuanced and multifaceted that one is able to pick up and realize new things with prior knowledge of what the story and its themes are all about. And what struck me ever stronger than the first couple of times observing it was Meruem, Gon, and Gyro's thematic position in Hunter x Hunter's narrative.
例えばお前たちの社会には国境という縄張りに似た仕切りがあろう。境の右では子供が飢えて死に、左では何もしないクズが全てを持っている。狂気の沙汰だ。
If we were to look back for a moment and remember the background and environment of the Phantom Troop and Meteor City, a society void of identity and purpose, Now, take those ideas and place them onto Gyro's small, isolated world that was his childhood. And you have very similar circumstances that can rationalize an individual's lack of morality and reason. The only difference is that unlike the Phantom Troop, Gyro has at one point in his life understood the value of human connection and the desire for purpose. Gyro grew up in a construction camp, learning how to mix concrete and lay bricks before he even knew how to speak, showcasing the harsh environment Gyro was born in and what was needed to survive. But if that wasn't enough, when all was said and done, Gyro, instead of returning home to a loving family's warm embrace, he was instead put in an inescapable hell in and throughout, as he returned home to a father who savagely beats him to near death for the most trivial of things. But amidst the abuse and harsh environment, Gyro was able to find a respect and adoration for the man, as a desperate attempt to find purpose and reason to be. However, once Gyro learned that it was all a lie, as while he was being beaten by another person, his father paid no mind to it and simply walked away. Gyro came to the conclusion that no one cared for him, and even concluded that the universe does not care for him, and by extension, Gyro's only way to rationalize this truth was by accepting the idea that he was not human, as he kills his father and sets out with the ambition of destroying the very social construct that abandoned him. And finally, with all of the information that each arc that Hunter x Hunter has shown us, the moral ambiguity of the world, environmental influences, and Togashi's criticisms of natural selection and moral clarity, shows us completely the contextualization of what Hunter x Hunter's story is all about. Hunter x Hunter is a story about humanity. But coinciding with humanity is power, and how humanity uses and tempers that power. Now that quote-unquote power is usually represented in Hunter x Hunter primarily in physical and mental prowess construed by Nen, but in regards to its narrative, Togashi's criticisms of political and personal power is deliberately overshadowed by the overarching representation of physical power in a shonen story because they're both two sides of the same coin. Togashi's criticism of mankind is that most, if not all, tend to have egocentric tendencies, ruled and captivated by our vanity and greed, able to sink to the depths and commit all kinds of atrocities if it means getting what we want. And none of this can ever be more clear than the interactions and outcome of the battle between Meruem and Netero, and Gon and Pito. Gon and Netero, for all intents and purposes, are meant to be represented as the hero of the arc and or story. Up to this point, both are represented as light-hearted and playful, mischievous and endearing, and both having the capability to use their qualities to influence others for the better. But when put in a position where those traits are no longer in a position or circumstance to show, things start to become even more grim. Gon, dualistic to Kurapika, is now plagued with vengeance and rage. Unable to steer clear from his initial perception of morality being black and white, begins to commit the very same evil acts that he criticizes the Phantom Troop for, as he threatens to take the life of an innocent person who has nothing to do with him. As he succumbs to his rage and sacrifices his entire being, all for an empty and cold ambition as vengeance. Togashi once again showcasing the impact of succumbing to the darkness, while Netero, both in power and in philosophy, is meant to represent Buddhist principles, such as attaining nirvana, which is meant to propagate perfect peace and happiness. And while Netero's personality and inflections reflect those principles, Netero had a mission put upon him by those who run the world behind the scenes. Netero commits an act that was meant to bring down the Chimera Ant King once and for all, but instead of the scene being portrayed as joyfully triumphant, it is represented as somber and sinister, as Netero pierces his heart, symbolically piercing through his own principles to complete the mission put on him by humanity. Perhaps what this shows is how dark humanity truly is in the world, or perhaps even more than that, is that this shows that there are no heroes in the story at all, as when the bomb in Netero's heart explodes, revealing its tragic and evil history as humanity's most sinister and immoral weapon, cutting the life short of Meruem and the Royal Guards just as soon as they manage to find compassion, honor, and empathy respectively. But perhaps what this all shows is that humanity is evil and beyond salvation.
さあ、乾杯しよう。乾杯しようじゃないか。人というものどもに。善人も悪人もいつの世も人は繰り返す。生むにはあまりに長く、学ぶにはあまりに短い時の螺旋状。だからこそよく欲しい、よく発するのだろう。命など人、血と使徒で満たされるほどのものなのに。
If there was anything I can say to describe what the last few episodes of this arc accomplished to convey to me personally, and perhaps others as well, is that it was nothing short of suffering. Togashi played us like a fiddle, toying with our emotions and deliberately showcasing these characters who were originally meant to be despised, only to eventually become characters who we fell in love with, only until we realized the mistakes of our original perceptions of these characters and how we immediately thought that they had to be stopped, only until their demise became unavoidable, as Togashi rips these characters away from us so soon, where I could only plead that this could not be how their journey came to an end. But simultaneously, he also took characters that we came to love throughout this long journey and showed us a side of them that we could not see coming. The brutally cold irony how I had originally urged and wished to see Gon succeed in his vengeance, only to reach the point where all I wanted now was for him to take a step back and become that bright and shining youth he has been up to this point. For these hunters and Chimera Ants to somehow, some way, as unrealistic as it was, if at any way possible, I had yearned for them to stop the fighting and come to understand one another as Meruem has. But that small glimmer of hope was immediately vanquished when you look back at the dark and menacing eyes of both Gon and Netero, and the inevitable explosion and after effects of the miniature rose. And as a domino effect, our bestest boy Killua, whom all he ever wanted in this world was to be considered a friend to Gon, was tossed aside and belittled by that same person he cherishes so deeply. That same person he sacrificed and grew so much for. To be left alone with the pain of seeing his best friend be in such a dark place, and with the belief that he was incapable of pulling him out of that darkness. Killua's insecurities get the best of him again, as just when he pulled himself together and realized that he was the only one who could help Gon, right before him was Gon, prepared to die and diminishing the last of his life, all for the sake of vengeance. The outcome was no individual's fault, not Gon, Netero, or even the Chimera Ants. This outcome was brought by this cruel world they are a part of. Netero knew that no amount of compromise would allow the Chimera Ant and humanity to coincide. Although he respected and held deep gratitude for Meruem, it was the upper echelon of humanity that gave him a job to do. Because he knew that had he not ended it here, many more would perish in a war soon to come with humanity's existence at stake. Perhaps what Togashi is saying here is that a world so corrupt is beyond saving. Perhaps the miniature rose is an allegory to the atomic bomb that devastated his own country. Perhaps this is all a commentary of the cruelty of humanity towards the world they live in. Or perhaps that may not be all that Togashi is trying to tell us.
俺の王はジャイロただ一人。貴様は貴様らは敵だ。
さようか。会えるといいな、そのものと。そして可能なる。人として生きるがよい。
Although the Chimera Ants at some point tethered on the edge of their humanity, in which it inevitably prevails, the fact that Meruem's humanity prevails, despite being put in the same situation and circumstance as humans, where humans themselves find themselves becoming tyrant with such power. Meruem rejects the status quo and embraces the virtuous side of his humanity. And as a result, Meruem obtains a philosophical demeanor, able to empathize and understand the reasons for humanity's cruelty, its histories, and our nuanced dispositions. And it's within those nuanced dispositions where Hunter x Hunter's main theme and commentary comes full circle. Even if humans have the potential of committing the most malicious of acts, the opposite is as true as the first. But perhaps just as important is the belief that people can change. And this is no better demonstrated than with Killua and Meruem. Breaking free from their environments, traditions, and overall darkness, both were able to find purpose in their lives. Meruem, a king filled with great ambitions and expectations set before him, was able to come to terms with his desire and purpose through genuine love and care. And that's all that they ever needed.
そうか。世はこの瞬間のために生まれてきたのだ。
俺の方こそお前に会えて本当によかった。
Nah, man, I'm glad I was the one to meet all of you! Fuck!
Even if our environment and our world is predicated around vicious darkness, it should not mean that we should allow it to consume us. That through mutual understanding, we can come to change for the better. Ironic that what is considered the darkest arc in shonen anime offers the brightest message in Hunter x Hunter's narrative. In a world that is predominantly ran by those with power, it's a mixture of the corrupted traits of humanity with those in power that creates a negative trickle-down effect to the people they lead, unable to prosper and thrive in the environment people may find themselves in, much like Gyro and the Phantom Troop alike. And while Gon and Gyro are of similar circumstances in regards to a fatherly figure in their life, it was the difference in their environment that shaped them to be who they are. But this does not mean that these two have unbending ideals and philosophies, because while Gon may have succumbed to his own darkness, that does not make him indefinitely evil. And while as an antagonist, Gyro is evil at this point, but we see many hints in the story of Gyro being able to form bonds and genuine friendships with those like Welfin, showcasing the example previously mentioned that people can change and everyone has kindness and humanity within them. It just may be harder to find than others. Much like the Phantom Troop, missing very important pieces of themselves that can help them come to understand their value, worth, and the environment they were raised that was the very reason for those traits to have been given birth. And looking even deeper, it was the corruption of those in power that was the catalyst for that environment's existence. Humanity is not inherently evil. Looking past the immoral and the malevolent, humanity and the world we live in is beautiful. Sometimes we just need to go on a journey and search for it. But don't search too hard. You might end up in the Dark Continent. It is so easy to succumb to darkness and personal desire, and it takes no effort in negatively affecting the world and those around you. But while it may be hard to find it within yourself to be kind in a world plagued under such corruption, it may be hard to stray from one's own desires under such circumstances, but if one is able to break free from their egocentric perspective and instead adopting self-awareness like Meruem has, even a single act of kindness can come a long way. And if more adopted this principle as a domino effect, perhaps, maybe, the world can change for the better. Despite the fact that we are capable of the most vile of things, we are also capable of the greatest good. The world is not kind. That is why we must be kind in its place. You may have made mistakes, perhaps even have regrets, but don't ever let it take over your heart, because deep down, I know there is good in everyone. So take a step back and know that you are better than you think you are. You are a good person. And if you ever seem to find yourself in a dark place, don't ever forget that bungee gum possesses the properties of both rubber and gum.
悪かっ
何にだ。
た。楽になりたくて全てから逃げようとした。苦しくても生きてみるよ。精一杯やったって死ぬ時を思えるように。